So, good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this debate. Our topic for today's debate is globalization started in 1980. So now, as we today's proposition, we strongly believe that globalization really started in 1980. Before we move to our argument, let me first define an important term for this debate, which is globalization. So when we say globalization, globalization is the word used to describe the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, populations brought across by border of trade in goods, services, technology, flows of investment, people, and information. So countries have built economic partnerships to facilitate these movements over many years. So we proposed to the idea that globalization started in 1980 because the term gained popularity after the Cold War, which is in the early 1990s. So as this cooperative management shaped our modern everyday life. This guide or this term uses more narrowly to refer to international trade and some of the investments among advanced economies, mostly focusing on the United States. So again, the term globalization was more commonly used in the year 1980s. So with this year 1980s, it reflects technological advancements or technological advances that made it easier and quicker to complete international transactions. It's either trade or financial flows. So it refers to an extension beyond national borders of these market forces that have operated for centuries at all levels of human economic activity, village markets, urban industries, or financial centers. So lastly, we are proposing the idea that globalization started in 1980 because when looking up to the history of globalization, many timelines will include this time period and talk about the expansion of global trade from 1980 and forward. So, of course, some doesn't believe that the starting point is usually considered to be in 1980, but the more modern definition is usually agreed that 1980s, in the year 1980s, globalization really started. So, ladies and gentlemen, as what I have told you today, that firstly, globalization, the term globalization gained popularity after the Cold War, which is in the early 1990s. Secondly, the term globalization began to be more used commonly in 1980s, and globalization really started in 1980s because in the 1980s, it reflects technological advances that made it easier to complete international transactions. And lastly, when looking up to the history of globalization, this time we'll talk about the expansion of global trades from this year to forward, and also this modern definition of globalization in the year 1980 really took off. So therefore, globalization really took off or really started in 1980s. So that would be the first argument of our group.
Good day. We group number 2 disagree with your concept of globalization started on 1980. So just like you said earlier, globalization is about the interconnectedness of economy, politics, and socio-cultural aspect of one nation to another. Also, you said that the term globalization was globally used way back 1980. So I will prove it to you that the concept of globalization was already there before the term globalization came in. So, just like I said earlier, globalization is about the interconnectedness of economy. So, when we said economy, it is about the trades or the exchange of goods and resources from one nation to another. So, therefore, I can say that if there is a trade, there is globalization. Then, when does the first trade occur? So, according to historians, when people started to settle down from smaller towns to larger towns of Mesopotamia, the idea of producing what they want and what they need started to fade away. Instead, they come up with a new one, and it is just exchanging the available resources or available goods that they have. For instance, a farmer could just exchange his grains of rice or corn for a kilo of meat. So in connection, globalization is also about the connection being formed across large distances. So the first long distance trade recorded was between Mesopotamia and Indus Valley that occurred in 3000 BC. So in this trade, it is almost exclusively to precious things such as spices, precious metals, and textiles. So though those places that are abundant with those things became financially rich too. So after the trade, there's so many trades follow their footsteps and crisscross the Eurasian continent. So first on the list is the Silk Road or the Silk Route that occurred between 1st century BC until the 5th century AD and continued by the 13th century AD to 14th century AD. So in this trade, those materials or those raw materials that can be seen in China started to appear on the other side of the continent, which is specifically in the country of Rome. Then followed by spice routes, then the Age of Discovery, then the first wave of globalization, then after that are the World Wars 1 and 2, then second and third wave of globalization, and lastly, the fourth wave, or rather the globalization 4.0, which currently happening right now, and was dominated by two powerful nations, namely China and USA. So, by just explaining the economical aspect of globalization, we can say that the concept of globalization was already there. It occurred before 1980. So that would be all. Thank you.
The broad reach of globalization easily extends to daily choices of personal, economic, and personal life. For example, greater access of modern technologies. So, let's talk about the internet. The internet official birthday is January 1, 1983. So, the modern internet was assembled networks by researchers as ARPANET adapted TCP or IP, which stands for Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol. So, the term globalization has been used by the economists, began applying it around 1983. So, Theodore Levitt usually credited to the term or in the term globalization through the article he wrote in 1983 for the Harvard Business Review entitled Globalizations of Market. So Theodore is a German-American economist defined the term globalized as the changes of technology and social behaviors that allow multinational companies to sell the same products worldwide.
In sociocultural, since the trade started to happen, goods and materials are not the only one being transferred, but also the culture and tradition of one country to another. Silk Road, or also called Silk Road, ancient trade route, linking China with the West that carried goods and ideas between the two great civilizations of Rome and China. Silk went westward, and wools, gold, and silver went east. China also received Nestorian Christianity and Buddhism from India via the Silk Road. The global trade routes out of Europe passed through the Atlantic as the home area, dwarfing the old trades routes of Mediterranean and the Silk Road, turning the Atlantic into the center of the emerging world economies for the coming centuries.
One of the most contentious issues of globalization is the effect of global economic integration on inequality and poverty. This article documents 5 trends in the modern era of globalization starting around 1980. The first trend is that growth rates in poor economies have accelerated and are higher than growth rates in rich countries for the first time in modern history. And according to what my teammate said, that these economists began applying globalization in 1980. Also, as what the other side said, that globalization is a process of interconnectedness. Well, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 and the end of Cold War in 1991 made the world interconnected because the communist bloc countries, which were restrained internationally from the capitalist West, began to integrate into global market economy. Trade and investment increased while barriers to migration and cultural exchange were lowered. Subsequently, globalization expanded. North American Free Trade Arrangement US, Canada, and Mexico in 1992 removed the barrier to the free flow of labor force, goods, and services, facilitating greater trade, investment, and migration across national borders in the year of 1990 and on.
Most importantly, I want to mention a proof that will talk through the side of political globalization, wherein it refers to the growth of political system worldwide. And this system includes governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and social movement organizations across the globe. Allow me to cite an example of what I am talking about. The creation and existence of the United Nations is called as one of the classic examples of political globalization. The United Nations is an intergovernmental organization that aims to maintain international peace and security as well, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, and be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It was created on October 24, 1945. In a nutshell, what I am trying to say is that the political aspect of globalization has been already there even before the year 1980, which then counters the first misconception statement that tells us that globalization started on the 1980. And that's all. Thank you.
I want you to know that the international monetary funds become part of the international financial system during the 1980s, where it provided capital to a few industrial countries under the Bretton Woods system. That until the early 1980s, the IMF made the majority of its lending conditional on implementation of detailed macroeconomic policy reform programs. Not until the international debt crisis of 1982 did the IMF assume its modern responsibilities as a financial crisis manager. As a unifying theme for the world economy in the 1980s, consider the idea of silent revolution in economic policy making, a subtle but ultimately dramatic drift throughout the decade and throughout much of the world toward policies that were more cooperative, outward-oriented, market-friendly than before. It seems silent because it occurred piecemeal with no obvious starting or completion point, but it was nonetheless revolutionary in its effect. Without it, the globalization of the 1990s could not have proceeded as it did.
So, another information or fact that will prove globalization started before 1980 is when Columbus' voyage commenced to the New World in 1492. There had been informal communications between the distant parts of the world for 1,000 years prior to that year. However, the European exploration of the ocean resulted in constant, rather than somewhat rare or direct human contact across the continents. And also other infos like the segmented trading world of Eurasia then. By 1350, networks of trade involve frequent movements of people, animals, money, goods, and microorganisms run from England to China. So the Mongols had done most to create a political framework for the overland network as attested by Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo. So yung pag-spread po ng the spread of Muslim trading communities along the littorals of the Indian Oceans, nag-create po yun ng world sea trade doon. So everything that has been happened with globalization in the half millennium, we can sum up it as global interchange has continued at an ever accelerating pace despite the intermittent setbacks.
Globalization is the integration of the trade over the borders of the nation state. Economic imperialism is a situation in which one country has a lot of economic power or influence over the other countries around the globe. Um, and Westernization is the adoption of the practices and culture of Western countries by the countries in other parts of the world. With these definitions, we can say that globalization is the only reason why there is economic imperialism or westernization that occurs in a country. Um, when we compare it to the different processes, globalization can stand alone. However, economic imperialism and westernization can't because they need globalization in able to occur. There are certain countries, for example, that are not having economic imperialism and westernization, but they are also a part of globalization. With having said all of this, I may say that our group can say that um, economic imperialism and westernization are not a type of globalization. Instead, it is the results that happens because of globalization. That's all. Thank you.
Globalization is usually recognized as global westernization. First of all, the influence of westernization refers to the societies adopting to the Western culture in areas such as lifestyle, clothing, technology, politics, and considerably more. The point is that the Western culture adds fuel in the age of imperialism, colonization, and globalization as it reinforces its hegemony almost across the globe. Despite the emergence of non-Western nations such as Asian countries as a key factor in globalization, the Western culture remains the dominant force in the world. For instance, according to an Indian sociologist named Mysore Srinivas, Westernization refers to the changes brought in the Indian culture and society because of the British governance that lasted over 150 years. The term also includes the changes at different levels of technology, institution, ideology, and even values. It seems that the globalized cultural industries are taking over the traditional forms of creation and the dissemination of culture, which makes the local culture to cease its construction of societal values, group identity, and social cohesion.
Globalization is simply the expansion of something, such as business, to global scale. Economic imperialism is not the same as globalization, because globalization is refers to economy alone between businesses, government, and other people in various countries. Although they are similar, but they are not the same. There where capitalism comes in, it makes a way for economic imperialism to make its appearance on globalization. Capitalism is economic system in which private individuals and businesses own capital goods. To make things simpler, from globalization to capitalism to economic imperialism. Indeed, globalization is the reason why we have capitalism that results of economic imperialism.
According to the Global Policy Forum of 2005, the spread of values, norms, and culture tends to promote Western capitalism. Westernization is the adoption of Western traditions or techniques in different parts. Nowadays, cultural globalization could be considered as a branch of Westernization. In fact, in the past and even today, globalization has been connected to Westernization. Many of those who have a positive view on globalization often seen it as an impact towards the Western world. Westernization is noted as a continuing process of globalization. With this being said, it is suggested that the Western idea has led to globalization, and that globalization has spread the Western culture, which is an ongoing process or cycle of Westernization.
Although they are similar but they are not identical. Globalization, in my opinion, is not the same as imperialism. Globalization is simply the projection of an idea, product, or concept across the globe. Definition when another idea or definition is discouraged upon, it becomes imperialism. It's globalization if two ideas, product, or goods will coexist.
From the perspective of others, Western dominance sometimes seen as continuation of Western imperialism in globalization. During this age of imperialism, the United States exerted in political, social, and economic control over countries such as Philippines, Cuba, Germany, Austria, Korea, and Japan. One of the most notable example of American imperialism in this age was the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, which allowed the United States to take possessions and control the ports, buildings, harbors, military equipment, and public property that are formally belong to the government of Hawaii. On January 17, 1893, the last monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, was deposed in coup d'etat largely by American citizens who were opposed to Liliuokalani's attempt to establish a new constitution. This action eventually resulted in Hawaii becoming America's 50th state in 1959. Globalization is simply projection of idea, product, or concept across the globe. When another idea, definition, or product was discouraged or infringed upon, it becomes imperialism. It's globalization if two ideas, concepts, or goods will coexist.
In addition of Lady Chanel said, globalization is simply the expansion of something, such as business to a global scale. However, economic imperialism makes the economic sense of countries abolished. Economic imperialism is not the same as the globalization. Globalization refers to the economy alone between businesses, governments, and people from various countries. The Internet's advances are primarily responsible for globalization. Also, economic imperialism is described as the country occupying several foreign countries and regions. Just for example, like what Japan did during World War II, where Japan continued its quest for national wealth and power through imperialism, well into the 20th century.
Some of the proof that the globalization is a type of westernization is the argument stating that the Western culture is erasing or influencing the other countries. For example, many countries such as India is adopting their Western jeans and t-shirt style of clothing rather than their traditional clothing. Other big example would be the topic of food. Western foods such as burger, fries, and pizza are overtaking the other countries who have their own traditional entries that they are accustomed to. Other example could be but are not limited to music, language, and lifestyle. This argument is basically stating that the Western culture is influencing the Eastern countries. Then the globalization and the Westernization is basically the same when it comes to adaptation and interconnection of tradition and culture. But as we go deep to the Westernization, we can say it is just a result of globalization, wherein the process of Westernization includes the colonization. And according to some facts that we have gathered, the Western countries is lack on developing their wealth, resources, and their labor, so that the only choice they have is to colonize the other countries to have their needs.
Globalization and Westernization are actually the same when it comes to adaptation and interconnection of cultures and traditions. But as we go deeper in Westernization, we can actually say that it is just a result of globalization. The process of Westernization includes colonization, wherein, according to some facts that we have gathered, Western countries lack the development on wealth, resources, and labors. That is why the only choice they have is to colonize other countries to have their needs.
The challenge of globalization has now been challenging the non-Western societies in Asia, just as the challenge of modernization had done a century before. Asian countries has been exposed to globalization as internationalization, that is the free flow of information, goods, cultures, and even social problems such as pollution and diseases. India, for example. Indian culture is one of the oldest and richest cultures in our modern time. However, now that the Western culture is kicking in, such as foods, dressings, festivals, government and military policies, this has caused a negative impact to the Indian culture in many ways. These changes will be seen as globalization as universalization and liberalization by the West, but globalization as Westernization and imperialism by the Asian countries.
According to the editors of Encyclopedia Britannica, many countries had Western types of government and military practices imposed on them. Westernization began um, with traders, colonizers, and missionaries from Western Europe who believed that their way of life was superior to those of the peoples in the countries to which they traveled. The occupied peoples were required or encouraged to adopt Western European business practices, languages, alphabets, and attire. And based on these facts that I have gathered, I can therefore conclude that globalization is not a type of westernization because its process doesn't involve colonization. Instead, it is the ability of influencing other countries without forcing them to adopt the practices or cultures of another nation.
Historical perspective, globalization now is the present stage of imperialism, and according to Rudolf Hilferding, an Austrian economist, and Vladimir Lenin, a Russian revolutionary politician and political theorist, they said that imperialism is a set of four basic characteristics. The first one is the development of monopoly capital. Second one is the emergence of finance capital. The third one is the export of investments from center to periphery. And lastly is the inter-imperialist competition. While some leaders, including Kemal Atatürk of Turkey and Reza Shah Pahlavi of Iran, they embraced globalization as westernization, and the tendency of the westernization to obliterate languages and cultural forms of other people also aroused widespread. And even now, in the modern world, Western culture fuels globalization as what it did during the age of imperialism and colonization. And even without encouraging or requiring other nations or different nations to adopt Western culture, people deliberately consume Western cultural creations, whether it is music, food, clothes, art, even femininity or masculinity. And as what the former president of Coca-Cola said, Robert Goizuela said that people around the world today are now connected by brand name consumer products as much as by anything else, which we may relate that westernization causes globalization, for globalization makes connection among nations fueled by westernization.
The connection between globalization and westernization is that colonization can only begin with globalization's assistance. Westerners cannot colonize and spread their ideology in a world without globalization. Westernization is not a subset of globalization. It happened or is occurring as a result of globalization. Only with the help of globalization can colonialism begin.